Hello, my name is Andre Ward, and I'm the Associate Vice President of the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the legal system from various perspectives, including those most impacted by the criminal legal system. We discuss critical questions about how the current system works, its intersections with social justice, and we highlight the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone affected. We ask you, the viewer, to spread the word about Both Sides of the Bars and share your comments with us on Twitter at the Fortune Society SOC. Today's show is entitled Sentencing Reform for Criminalized Survivors. Despite the criminal legal system's espoused goal of securing justice for crime victims, all too often, survivors of domestic violence are arrested, prosecuted, and punished. For example, survivors may be criminalized for coerced criminal acts or for protecting themselves or loved ones. According to a new report by the Sentencing Project and Survivors Justice Project, the need for sentencing reform for survivors is urgent. In this episode, our guest is TSP's, or the Sentencing Project's Sentencing Reform Counsel, Liz Komar, formerly an assistant district attorney who advocates for an end to extreme sentencing in the state and federal criminal legal systems. And Liz is a sentencing reform counsel at the Sentencing Project. She advocates for an end to extreme sentencing in the state and federal criminal legal system as part of the Sentencing Project's campaign to end life imprisonment, including by leading federal advocacy efforts. And prior to joining the Sentencing Project, Liz was the director of strategic initiatives at Fair and Just Prosecution, an organization dedicated to reforming prosecutorial practices and culture. She also served as an assistant district attorney in Brooklyn, New York, and as an attorney advisor in the U.S. Department of Justice Executive Office for Immigration Review. Liz, thanks so much for joining us here at Both Sides of the Bars. How are you feeling today?
Good. That was quite an intro. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm so grateful for all of the work that the Fortune Society does, especially as a longtime New Yorker until very recently.
Well, we thank you for your longstanding work in the criminal legal system, and certainly the work that you're undertaking now as it relates to sentencing reform for criminalized survivors. And I think obviously, we like to just jump right into it because this issue is so significant, and the work that you're undertaking here will have real impact as we see this legislation being passed at some point. So just talk to us about why is sentencing reform for survivors of domestic violence and trafficking important?
Absolutely. So first, I want to back up and just acknowledge the work of the Survivors Justice Project, who aren't here with me today. They're a collective of activists, lawyers, social workers, students, and researchers, many of whom are survivors themselves of both domestic violence and long-term incarceration, and they fight for decarceration under New York's Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, and they are the issue experts on this. The Sentencing Project was honored to partner with them to lift up and amplify their wisdom so it could be of use to advocates in other states. And so that's my preamble about how they are the fantastic experts that we have learned so much from. And in terms of why sentencing reform for domestic violence and trafficking is important, let's start with what we know about criminalized survivors. Research on criminalized survivors is egregiously scarce, but we know two things: that the incarceration rate of women has grown explosively over the last quarter century, and that most women in prison report a history of abuse, many more than non-incarcerated women. And while not all of those women would necessarily qualify for survivor resentencing, which usually requires a link between the victimization and the offense they committed, a meaningful number would probably be eligible for relief. And survivor resentencing doesn't just benefit women. The majority of adult men serving felony sentences report a history of childhood abuse, and a portion would also qualify. And also there are high rates of victimization amongst gender nonconforming individuals and gender minorities who would likely benefit from sentencing relief for survivors of abuse. And really there's three big reasons that I would say reform is important with that background. We need it for justice. We need it to decrease those incarceration rates. We need it to reflect that people age out of crime. And we need it to make a dent in extreme sentencing.
Totally. And I know it's really significant. Members of the LGBTQIA plus community are impacted by this, the trans community, obviously, in many different ways. So obviously it's important, significant. And so, one of the things we're thinking about is like, how do survivors end up in prison?
Surviving domestic violence can look like crime, and the legal system rarely has any checks or balances to deal with how we criminalize survivors. And so what that means is that the process of escaping a domestic violence relationship, for example, can mean not having housing. It can mean being in dire financial straits, or someone may be coerced into crime by a abusive partner, or as a long-term response to prior victimization. Somebody may end up using substances in order to cope with the trauma of their prior abuse. And so there are many ways that someone can enter the criminal legal system, and then we don't really have many mechanisms to deal with that. Self-defense justifications are very narrow. And that's assuming that people are even able and ready to tell their own story. Trauma changes the brain. It can lead to memory discrepancies and impairment. It can mean that people at the time of their arrest aren't ready to talk about what's happening, or it can mean that they're not able to if they still rely on the person who harmed them for practical things like taking care of their children, or if they rely on the person who abused them's family members for that. So there are a multitude of reasons that people may not be ready or able to tell their story, including that legally it may not be in their interest to talk about why they committed the offense if their best defense is to say that, not admit that they did so. And then assuming we get to the point of sentencing mitigation, there's simply not enough remedies in any state, really, for people who have been victimized. And that's really compounded by states in which judges are sentencing people with mandatory minimums. There's so little room for mercy or understanding.
And when you think about that, right, Liz, the idea is of someone who has experienced trauma owing to being involved in domestic violence situation and that being criminalized, go into a prison or a jail and essentially are re-traumatized, right? Because the environment in and of itself, right, lends to people being traumatized, and there's no interventions put in place to traumatize people in certain ways. So there has to be something put in place to ensure that people are actually having their trauma treated in some way rather than compounded. And so, as we think about this more, why do domestic violence survivors need sentencing lookbacks, for example? And why are current sentencing laws inadequate?
Sure. So first, I think everybody deserves a sentencing look back. The Sentencing Project and the Survivors Justice Project support universal second look after 10 years, meaning everybody should have an opportunity to have their sentence re-examined then in light of the wealth of evidence about how people age out of crime. But that's extra pressing for survivors, since we know, under the current legal system, many are serving incredibly unjust sentences that deeply offend the conscience, simply because we don't have laws that are designed to recognize the impact of victimization. And mitigation often is highly limited in terms of what factors can be considered. And so New York responded to that problem by passing the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act. This report recommends some changes to it to make it even more robust, but it was still a landmark piece of legislation that has benefited 40 individuals now and saved them a collective 80 years of incarceration based on what would have been their earliest release dates. And so what the DVSJA does is, for a survivor to get relief, they have to demonstrate that they meet 3 standards: that at the time of the offense, they experience substantial physical, sexual, or psychological abuse, that the abuse was a significant contributing factor to the offense, and that the sentence is imposed, or that would have been imposed in the absence of DVSJA mitigation, is unduly harsh. That's a high bar. It's not necessarily what I would call the ideal, but it's still probably the strongest model that we have yet in the US. We're beginning to see advocates in other states push for laws that are inspired by the DVSJA, not necessarily the same. Survivor justice laws need to be shaped by the women that they would benefit, and others inside prisons. I say women as a shorthand because disproportionately women benefit from these laws. And so in Oklahoma, for instance, they're considering a survivors justice bill that we hope will pass into law this year, that would focus on providing relief to women convicted of homicide, because that's the category of individuals in Oklahoma prisons that survivors there feel like need relief the most right now. And so what sentencing relief will look like will vary by state to state. And this report has some really highly technical recommendations for advocates and lawyers interested in drafting and passing these bills. But at minimum, it should provide relief to people going forward, give them an opportunity for a lower sentence at the time of sentencing, and then also create some sort of retroactive relief so that people who have already been sentenced have an opportunity to receive a shorter one. And that's not justice. I want to make that very clear. Justice would be not criminalizing survivors in the first place. It would be not having survivors in the first place, interrupting these cycles of harm altogether. But this is really valuable harm reduction that moves us a little bit closer to justice.
Sure, and that's why, the current sentencing laws are inadequate based on what you just explained. And, I know like poverty and other factors contribute to domestic violence and abuse. And obviously, unfortunately, women are the most likely, right, to experience domestic violence, then ultimately to be arrested, right, when there's some fatality involved, right, from the person who was responsible for causing the harm, et cetera. And as we have read the report, Liz, and we think about the technical recommendations that you listed, for advocates, right, and policymakers who are seeking to pass like the survivor sentencing reform laws in their states, like what advice does this report offer?
Sure. So all of this advice is drawn from lessons learned from New York's Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, things that the practitioners in the state would flag as compromises that were made during the negotiation to pass the bill that are less than ideal, that they wouldn't want to see replicated in other states if possible, and also things that they've encountered during implementation or litigation of these cases afterwards that are preventing people who deserve relief from reaching it. So with that in mind, the first kind of bucket of recommendations in the report are around creating broad trauma-informed eligibility criteria. So first would just be defining domestic abuse very broadly to include intimate partner violence, which is often what people think of when we say domestic violence, but also all family relationships or commercial sexual exploitation. We also recommend that all offenses and sentence lengths be eligible for relief. There's often an instinct, at least among legislators who are considering resentencing legislation, to carve out the folks with the most serious offenses and the most extreme sentences. And that's not how we're going to make a serious dent in mass incarceration. It's going to also deny some of the people who need relief the most any shot at it. So it's really important to fight against those exclusions. And we also recommend that survivors have the ability to apply for relief multiple times. So at the time of their original sentencing, and then later if needed, just recognizing that impact of trauma that often prevents people from coming forward at the time of their original sentencing. And then we also, in kind of a second bucket, if that's okay, talk about developing a legal process that's accessible to survivors, meaning that people in prison need to be able to navigate it, ideally with an attorney, but recognizing that not everyone in many states will have one. So it needs to be simple. People need to have a form they can fill out. It needs to be free for them to access it. They ideally should have counsel. Evidentiary requirements shouldn't be hurdles that are almost impossible to navigate. They should be realistic. And survivors need support during this entire process, because even the mere process of filling out this application is re-traumatizing, even if it weren't in the prison. But combine that with a prison environment, and this is extraordinarily psychologically stressful, and people need support as they apply for relief, and then even if they succeed when they enter.
Yeah, and so when you think about that here in New York State, for example, right? They have something that's called the Office of Victim Services. Is there some role that the Office of Victim Services would play here in giving people resources that they need in some way? And I would imagine in different states throughout the country, there may be something akin to an Office of Victim Services, depending on the size of the state and its budget, et cetera. Any comments on that?
Sure. The state of victim services varies wildly throughout the country. I remember once visiting a prosecutor in Durham, and the entirety of her victim services was a conference room that was available for witnesses to wait for trial. That was it. And so in not every state would the Office of Victim Services probably be the right place to house this. I think we also have to ask, who would survivors trust? Is it necessarily going to be a state agency? Is it going to be a domestic violence organization in the community that has more of a foundation of trust with people who are incarcerated? Who do defense attorneys trust? And so the answer is probably going to vary a little bit, but at the end of the day, it needs to be an entity that's competent in caring for survivors of abuse, that is able to develop trauma-informed and procedurally just procedures. And to do that often means that we need to create some more funding. And I hope that that's something that states do, and also that philanthropic funders consider down the road.
Sure. I mean, see, funding is a key part of this, right? But what about the healing side of things, Liz, for people who have been harmed and obviously are criminalized survivors? What might be some healing interventions that people can engage in based on the experience that comes to mind?
Sure. So I am a lawyer, so I hesitate to comment on what is healing for folks, but I know in the context of applying for DVSGA and re-entering, people need counseling as they apply to provide them with sometimes the guidance and healing that they need to formulate their claim, to state their abuse out loud, because it takes so much healing and so much bravery to even get to that point. And then they need specialized reentry services. So that's people who are trained to treat survivors of domestic violence. And that's not going to be every reentry service provider, since the vast majority of people in the criminal legal system are men. And so not every reentry service provider is going to be competent to handle survivors of domestic violence. And so people deserve care that understands the unique dynamics of recovering from abuse.
And, how important is it, Liz, for people who are criminalized survivors to inform the decision processes, right, as it relates to how they want things to look in terms of policy recommendations, or what interventions they need to address the harm that they've experienced that's relative to them? How important is that?
It's essential. Survivors need to be at the core of creating these bills. They were in New York. They were also at the heart of implementing them. The population of incarcerated women in most states is usually fairly small. Like, for instance, Oregon is considering a DVSGA bill. They have 900 women. And that means that those women who are involved in creating these bills may also have a pretty good initial sense of who inside may benefit from them. Mm-hmm. They are the initial outreach network to make sure that survivors of abuse are identified, begin to receive care, are connected to attorneys, because unfortunately, it's an almost universal truth that many survivors of abuse don't recognize that what they experienced was abuse. They need people who care about them to often make that initial identification and help nudge them towards healing. And so It's incredibly important for survivors of violence to shape the implementation, to shape the legal standard itself, to set priorities, and to tell their stories. Because we don't change hearts and minds with statistics. We do it with human stories, people willing to be incredibly brave and testify before legislatures, put their story in an op-ed, put their face on an otherwise abstract law. And so those are really the heroes who get these bills passed.
And obviously, Liz, you're a hero in and of yourself, right, to take up this cause, right, in collaboration and partnership with those who are survivors, right, and had their experiences criminalized, right? And you know, as a person that's deeply committed to this, like what might you want our viewers to know? Any other additional thoughts you might want our viewers to know in their support of this legislation, right? In addition to what could they be in action doing in their respective states?
Sure. So I assume the audience of this program is already pretty committed to criminal justice reform, probably even to sentencing reform, but they may view this as a very niche issue. And so I would push on that. Just because the population of survivors, or particularly women, is smaller within the criminal legal system doesn't mean that this isn't really important. Women and gender minorities have been strongly neglected in criminal legal reform, but also this would benefit everyone. This is a starter moment in advocacy to begin to talk to legislators who are very skeptical of other sentencing reforms about creating resentencing opportunities. It's an opportunity after these laws are passed to also prove to them that resentencing is safe, that people can come home and be wonderful, fully contributing members of society, parenting their children, becoming leaders in the community. And so even if, you have a viewer who says, domestic violence is not my issue, if sentencing reform matters to you, if second looks matter to you, then I hope survivor resentencing bills matter to you. And then in terms of what people can do, I think it's always great to be in contact with your legislators to educate them on why you think sentencing reform is important for survivors, or sentencing reform more broadly, helping them understand that there are so many people in our prisons who don't need to be there. If folks have a desire to get engaged in our various campaigns, they should certainly go to the Sentencing Project's website and get on our mailing list, and we send out some action alerts. We have wonderful partners in New York like RAP, and people can also support the Survivors Justice Project and their litigation work. There are so many ways to get involved here, and I hope that people do, because so many survivors deserve to come home.
Liz Komar of the Sentencing Project, the Sentencing Reform Council, we thank you so much for joining us here at Both Sides of the Bars. Is there, again, any website you provided for the Sentencing Project that people can write to get in contact with folk? If you want to provide that, that would be great too for folk. But we thank you for joining us today, and we certainly look forward to having you back on Both Sides of the Bars to hopefully give a good update that this legislation is passed. But Liz, how can people get in contact with folk at the Sentencing Project?
Sure. So our website is sentencingproject.org. If you go on there, you'll see a way to join our mailing list, and then you'll stay up to date on all of our publications and opportunities for action.
Absolutely. Again, thank you so much, Liz. We really appreciate that. And we'd like to thank you, our listeners, or rather our viewers, for joining us all for this thought-provoking discussion. In the meantime, on behalf of the Fortune Society, we thank you so much for tuning in to Both Sides of the Bars. And if you're interested in finding out more about Fortune Society, please check us out on the web at fortunesociety.org. That's fortunesociety.org. Or you can go on Facebook and you can type in the Fortune Society. This is Andre Ward, and I appreciate you joining us as we critically look at both sides of the bars.
If you want to know how to reduce crime in America, in New York City, you do it one person at a time. creating an environment that celebrates the human spirit. Recidivism is a result of societal failure to do that, and Fortune has demonstrated that lives can change.
I tell people all the time, this is where I grew up. This is where I learned what being a man is and what being a productive citizen means.
It is the work of this great organization that has helped to shape my ideas, drive my conviction, and further deepen my commitment to the cause.
For more than half a century, you have amplified the voices of those who are impacted by unfair policies and helped thousands of justice-involved people transform their lives. You have led by example to show how we can help formerly incarcerated individuals come home, rebuild their lives, and contribute to our communities.
It's never about the contract or the milestones first. It's always about the individual. These individuals were literally suffering in incarceration because they just didn't have an address to go to. And for them to walk into a place where it's about them and only them and what they need and only what they need.
There's one person in particular, he came through our programs and he ended up opening his own construction company, and he came back to Fortune and said, I want to hire people from here, and it was like about how if you lift one person up, they lift others. Even if it's just one person that this happens to, it's worth it. And I know that it's not just one person, it's many people.
COVID-19 worsened existing barriers to reentry. Reentry is hard enough as is, but even harder during a pandemic. As people were released from Rikers early due to COVID-19, our services and housing were needed even more.
Fortune Society has kept their doors open during the pandemic. We offer them incentives when they arrive to the community, as well as refer them to specific resources. And we also host our workshops virtually where the clients are able to remain engaged. And we also launched our care package program, and where we were able to provide over 200 care packages with toiletries to clients that were released into the community.
Fortune's mission is more important than ever. It's a two-pronged mission. The service part is about being there for people as they rebuild their lives after experience in the criminal justice system. And as we give our services, we see the barriers that people face, and we do fierce advocacy about job discrimination, housing discrimination, conditions of confinement, and all of the albatrosses that are hung around the necks of people as they finish their time and try to build new lives.